Hello dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward. Perhaps you know me from warm pages as well. Before we begin, I'd love to hear about a hobby or small joy that brightened your week. Maybe knitting, gardening, reading, or listening to cozy mysteries like this one. Share your little joys with us, and don't forget to subscribe. Now get comfortable, our story is about to begin. Chapter 1. A disturbing discovery at the Kirk. Police Sergeant Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of the Lockdub police station, his hazel eyes surveying the frost-covered landscape with the sort of contentment that comes from having absolutely nothing urgent to do. December had settled over Sutherland like a cold blessing, and the village of Lockdub slumbered peacefully beneath a pewter sky. His dog Lugs, a mongrel of indeterminate heritage and uncertain loyalty, lay sprawled before the peat fire, snoring gently. The beast had eaten an entire plate of sausages meant for Hamish's breakfast and was now sleeping off his crime with the shamelessness of the truly unrepentant. Hamish sighed. It was the 20th of December, and all was well. Too well, perhaps. The very quiet made him suspicious. Experience had taught him that when Lockdub appeared peaceful, trouble was usually brewing somewhere beneath the surface, like one of those hot springs that bubbled up in unexpected places. The telephone rang, shattering his reverie. Lugs opened one eye, decided the noise was not his problem, and resumed snoring. Lockdub Police Station, Hamish answered, already knowing that his peaceful morning was about to end. Hamish! It was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, her voice shrill with distress. You must come to the Kirk at once. It's Mrs. Grant. She's dead. Mrs. Euphemia Grant? Hamish felt a pang of genuine sorrow. Euphemia Grant had been one of the gentle souls of Lockdub, a woman whose kindness had touched everyone in the village. Yes, Mrs. McAllister found her this morning in the vestry. Oh, Hamish, it's dreadful. And with Christmas coming. I'll be right there, Hamish said, reaching for his jacket. He looked down at Lugs. Come on, you useless article. Work to do. Lugs groaned, but heaved himself to his feet, following Hamish out into the bitter cold. The Kirk stood at the edge of the village, a stern stone building that had witnessed generations of Highland worship, christenings, marriages, and funerals. As Hamish approached, he could see a small cluster of people gathered at the entrance, their breath forming white clouds in the icy air. Mrs. Wellington bustled forward, her large frame wrapped in multiple layers of wool. She's still in there, Hamish. We didn't want to move her until you'd seen her. It's all so shocking, who would have thought? Where exactly did you find her? Hamish asked. It was Lorna McAllister who found her, Mrs. Wellington replied, lowering her voice. Poor Lorna. She's taken it very hard. They were close, you know. Hamish knew, in a village the size of Lockdub, everyone knew everything about everyone else, or thought they did. Lorna McAllister was the woman who made things happen at the Kirk. She organised the flower rota, coordinated the Christmas bazaar, and generally kept the church running smoothly, while the minister, Mr. Wellington, preached his lengthy sermons and worried about theology. I'd like to speak with Mrs. McAllister, Hamish said. She's inside, sitting in one of the pews. Dr. Dalrymple is with the body. Hamish entered the Kirk, Lugs padding silently behind him. The interior was cold and dim, lit only by the weak winter light filtering through the narrow windows. The smell of old stone, furniture polish, and fresh pine filled the air. At the front of the Kirk, the preparations for the Christmas nativity display were evident. Greenery had been draped along the pews, and a wooden cradle, obviously old and lovingly restored, stood near the altar. In the third pew from the front, a woman sat with her head bowed. Lorna McAllister was in her late 50s, a handsome woman with iron grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked up as Hamish approached, her eyes red from crying. Mrs. McAllister, Hamish said gently, I'm so sorry. I know Mrs. Grant was a good friend to you. She was more than a friend, Lorna said, her voice breaking. She was like a mother to me, Hamish. I can't believe she's gone. Can you tell me what happened this morning? Lorna took a deep breath, composing herself. I came early to finish preparing for the nativity display. We were planning to have everything ready by tonight. When I arrived, I noticed the vestry door was ajar. That was odd because we always keep it locked. I went to investigate and found her there, sitting in the chair beside the cradle. The cradle? Yes. The old wooden cradle we use for the baby Jesus. It's been used in our nativity display for generations. We'd just finished restoring it. Euphemia had been very particular about it this year, insisting everything be done properly. Was there anything unusual about how she looked? Lorna frowned, thinking. She seemed peaceful, as if she'd simply fallen asleep. But her lips were slightly blue and her skin was cold. I knew immediately she was dead. I didn't touch anything. I called Mrs. Wellington right away, and she telephoned you. Did Mrs. Grant have any health problems that you knew of? She was old, Hamish, but she was strong. She walked to the kirk every day and never complained. I can't imagine what could have happened. The vestry door opened, and Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple emerged. She was a brisk, efficient woman in her 40s who had taken over the practice from old de Brodie 2 years earlier. She saw Hamish and walked over to him. "You'll want to see the body," she said without preamble. "Though I can tell you now, this wasn't natural causes." Hamish felt a familiar sinking, sensation in his stomach. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be without a proper autopsy. The signs are all there. I'd say poisoning, though I'll need to run tests to confirm what substance was used." "Poisoning," Hamish repeated, his mind already working. Murder in Loch Dup, just before Christmas. He should have known the peace was too good to last. He followed de Dalrymple into the vestry, leaving Lorna in the pew. The small room was neat and orderly, with shelves holding hymn books and church supplies. In a simple wooden chair beside a small table sat Mrs. Euphemia Grant. She looked exactly as Lorna had described her, peaceful and serene, her hands folded in her lap. She wore her good Sunday dress and a warm wool cardigan. On the table beside her was a delicate china teacup still half full. "The tea," Hamish said, nodding toward the cup. "Most likely," de Dalrymple agreed. "Though we'll need to test it. I'd estimate she's been dead since last night, probably sometime between 8 and midnight." Hamish studied the scene carefully. The vestry showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. Everything was in its place. The old wooden cradle stood against one wall, lined with fresh straw and a soft blanket. It looked ready to receive the figure of the infant Jesus that would be placed there on Christmas Eve. But why had Euphemia been here so late? And why would anyone want to kill a harmless old woman? "Did she have any visitors that you know of?" Hamish asked Lorna, who had appeared in the doorway, unable to stay away. "She was often here in the evenings," Lorna said. "She liked to pray in the quiet. But lately she'd been spending more time with the cradle. She kept saying it had to be perfect for Christmas Eve." "Did she say why it was so important?" Lorna hesitated. "She said something odd a few days ago. She said the cradle must be emptied before Christmas Eve. I didn't understand what she meant. We always put the baby Jesus figure in on Christmas Eve. That's tradition." "The cradle must be emptied," Hamish repeated thoughtfully. He looked at the ancient wooden cradle, worn smooth by generations of use. What had Euphemia meant? "I'll need to secure this area," he said, "and I'll need statements from everyone who was at the kirk yesterday evening. Mrs. McAllister, can you provide me with a list of everyone who had keys to the kirk?" "Of course," Lorna said. "Though several people have keys, the minister, myself, Mrs. Wellington, and a few of the elders." Hamish nodded. This was going to be complicated. In a small Highland village, murder was always complicated. Everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone had secrets, and secrets in Loch Duba were like underground streams, flowing beneath the surface until something brought them bubbling up into the light. He looked once more at the peaceful face of Euphemia Grant and felt a wave of anger. She had been a good woman, a kind woman. Someone had taken her life, and Hamish, Macbeth, intended to find out who. "I'll be starting my investigation today," he said. "Dr. Dalrymple, please let me know as soon as you have the autopsy results." As he left the kirk, lugs trailing behind him, Hamish noticed the Christmas decorations that had been strung up around the village. They seemed suddenly incongruous, cheerful in the face of death. He thought of the cradle, waiting empty in the vestry, and of Euphemia's mysterious words. The cradle must be emptied. What had the old woman known? And had that knowledge cost her her life? Christmas in Lochduber was going to be darker than usual this year. Chapter 2. A Cradle That Raises Questions. By midday, news of Euphemia Grant's death had spread through Lochduber like wildfire through dry heather. Hamish had barely returned to the police station when the first of the well-meaning busybodies arrived, ostensibly to offer condolences, but really to extract whatever information they could. Mrs. Jessie Curry and her twin sister Nessie arrived first, bearing a casserole that looked as if it had been hastily assembled from whatever lurked in the back of their refrigerator. "Such a tragedy," Jessie said, planting herself firmly in Hamish's kitchen. "And poor Euphemia of all the people. She never had an enemy in the world." "Never had an enemy in the world?" Nessie echoed, as was her habit. Hamish accepted the casserole with as much grace as he could muster, and ushered them out before they could settle in for a proper interrogation. He had work to do, and the Curry sisters' version of helping generally involved hindrance. Dr. Dalrymple had promised to have preliminary results by evening, and Hamish spent the afternoon methodically interviewing everyone who'd been near the kirk the previous day. The minister, Mr. Wellington, had left after evensong at 6 o'clock. Mrs. Wellington had departed shortly after, heading home to prepare dinner. Several parishioners had been in and out during the day working on Christmas preparations. It was tedious work, and by the time Hamish made his way back to the kirk at 5 o'clock, the winter darkness had already descended, turning the world into shadows and silhouettes. Lorna McAllister was waiting for him, as arranged, with the church schedules and a list of everyone who held keys. She had recovered some of her composure, though her eyes still showed the strain of grief. "I've written down everything I could think of," she said, handing him a neatly organised folder. "The volunteer schedule, the list of key holders, and the people who were here yesterday." Hamish was impressed by her efficiency. "This is very helpful, Mrs. McAllister. I know this must be difficult for you." "Work helps," she said simply. "Euphemia would have wanted everything to continue properly. The Christmas services, the nativity display. She was devoted to the kirk." "Tell me about the cradle," Hamish said. "You mentioned she was particular about it this year." Lorna led him into the kirk, where the ancient wooden cradle still stood near the altar. In the dim light it looked almost otherworldly, a relic from another time. "It's been in the kirk for over 100 years, Lorna explained. "Every Christmas Eve we place the figure of baby Jesus in it during the midnight service. But this year Euphemia insisted on having it completely restored. She hired a woodworker from Strathbane to repair the joints and refinish the wood. She oversaw every detail." Hamish examined the cradle carefully. It was beautifully made, the wood worn smooth by the generations of hands. Fresh straw had been placed inside, along with a soft white blanket. "And she kept saying it must be emptied before Christmas Eve?" "Yes. At first I thought she meant we shouldn't put the figure in early, that we should wait for the proper time. But she seemed almost agitated about it. She said it repeatedly, as if it were vitally important." Lorna's voice dropped. "Hamish, do you truly think someone killed her? It seems impossible." "I'm afraid Dr. Dalrymple was quite certain," Hamish said gently. "I'll know more after the autopsy." Lorna shuddered. Who would do such a thing? She was 78 years old. She spent her days in prayer and good works. That's what I need to find out. Did she seem worried or frightened recently? Did she mention being concerned about anything?" Lorna thought for a moment. "Not frightened exactly, but she did seem preoccupied. She spent more time alone in the kirk than usual. I found her here several times, late in the evening, sitting beside the cradle." "Did she say what she was doing?" "Praying, I assumed. But now I wonder, there was something on her mind, something that troubled her deeply." Hamish's mobile phone buzzed. It was Dr. Dalrymple. I have the preliminary results, she said without preamble. It was definitely poison. Aconite, to be specific. Wolfsbane. It was in the tea. How much would it take to kill someone? Not much. A few milligrams would be fatal, especially to someone Euphemia's age. Death would have occurred within a few hours of ingestion. The symptoms would have included nausea, a numbness, and cardiac arrest. Given the amount I found in her system, she likely died quite quickly. Where would someone get aconite? It grows wild in some gardens. The plant is quite attractive, which is why people cultivate it despite its toxicity. Several people in Sutherland grow it. You'd need to know what you were looking for, though. It's not common knowledge. Hamish thanked her and ended the call. He turned back to Lorna, who was watching him with anxious eyes. It was poison, he said. In her tea. Lorna's hand went to her mouth. Who would have access to her tea? She always brought her own flask from home. She was particular about it. Always drank the same blend. Where is her flask now? I don't know. I didn't see it in the vestry this morning. Perhaps she didn't bring it yesterday. Or perhaps the killer took it, Hamish said thoughtfully. Mrs. McAllister, I'll need you to think very carefully. Did Euphemia have any disagreements with anyone recently? Any arguments, no matter how small they might have seemed? Lorna hesitated. There was some tension with Father Munro. Father Munro? Hamish knew Father Alistair Munro, the Catholic priest who served a small congregation in Lochdub. He was a young man, earnest and energetic, sometimes a bit too progressive for the more traditional members of the community. He suggested that perhaps the kirk and the chapel might work together on a joint Christmas service. Euphemia was quite opposed to the idea. She felt traditions should be maintained. They had words about it a few weeks ago. Strong words? Euphemia could be firm when it came to matters of faith, but I can't imagine Father Munro would harm anyone. He's a priest, for heaven's sake. Hamish had been a policeman long enough to know that being a priest or a doctor or any other respectable profession was no guarantee of innocence. But he kept this thought to himself. Anyone else? Margaret Boyd has always been somewhat cool toward Euphemia. Her baby died years ago under tragic circumstances. Some people whispered that Euphemia might have been involved, though I never believed it. Involved how? I don't know the details. It was before my time in Lochdub, but Margaret has never set foot in this kirk since it happened. Hamish made a mental note to speak with Margaret Boyd. What about family? Did Mrs. Grant have any relatives? None that I know of. She never married, never had children of her own. The kirk was her family. We were her family. Lorna's voice broke again. She was a good woman, Hamish. She deserved better than this. After Lorna left, Hamish remained in the kirk, sitting in one of the pews and thinking. The building was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling in the cold. He looked at the cradle, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight through the window. The cradle must be emptied. What had Euphemia meant? Had she known she was in danger? Had she been trying to warn someone, to convey some message before it was too late? Hamish stood and walked to the cradle. He ran his hand along its smooth edges, feeling the history embedded in the wood. Then, on impulse, he reached beneath the straw and the blanket, searching. His fingers touched something. Carefully, he extracted it. It was a piece of fabric, old and faded, folded into a small square. He unfolded it gently. It was a tiny baby's gown, handmade, with delicate embroidery along the collar. The stitching was exquisite, done with love and care, hidden beneath the straw, as if Euphemia had wanted it found, but only by someone who was looking. Hamish held the small garment up to the light. The fabric was yellowed with age, at least several decades old. Why had Euphemia hidden it in the cradle? What did it mean? He carefully placed the gown in an evidence bag and left the kirk. Outside, the village lay quiet under the stars. Christmas lights twinkled in windows, and somewhere in the distance someone was singing carols. But Hamish felt no joy. A woman was dead, murdered in a place that should have been a sanctuary. And somewhere in Lochdub, a killer was going about their business, perhaps singing carols and trimming trees, pretending that nothing had happened. He walked back to the police station through the frozen streets, lugs at his heels. The dog seemed to sense his mood and refrained from his usual diversions, following close and quiet. Inside, Hamish spread the church schedules and notes across his desk. He studied the list of names, the timetable of who had been where and when. Somewhere in these details was the answer. Euphemia Grant had been a midwife once. Lorna had mentioned that in passing. Perhaps her past held the key to her present death. Tomorrow he would start digging into the old woman's history, into the years before she came to Loch Dubh. He looked at the tiny gown carefully preserved in its evidence bag. Someone's baby had worn this decades ago, someone's child. The cradle must be emptied. Perhaps, Hamish thought, it already had been, but not in the way Euphemia had intended. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Knew Too Much. The morning brought sleet, the sort of miserable half-frozen rain that made the Highlands look bleak and unwelcoming. Hamish stood at his stove frying bacon and eggs while Lugs watched with the intensity of a starving wolf despite having been fed an hour earlier. "You're a terrible glutton," Hamish told the dog, who responded by wagging his tail hopefully. Hamish had spent the previous evening on the telephone with various officials, trying to piece together Euphemia Grant's history. What he'd learned had been illuminating, if frustratingly incomplete. Euphemia had indeed worked as a midwife in Inverness for nearly 30 years, before retiring to Loch Dubh 25 years ago. Her departure from the profession had been abrupt, with no clear explanation in the official records. He needed to speak with someone who had known her back then, someone who might remember what had happened. The problem was that most of Euphemia's contemporaries were either dead or scattered across Scotland. Hamish was pondering this problem when there was a sharp knock at the door. He opened it to find Jessie Curry standing on his doorstep, clutching her handbag as if it contained state secrets. "I need to speak with you, Hamish," she said, glancing around furtively. "About Euphemia?" "Come in then," Hamish said, resigning himself to whatever gossip Jessie was about to impart. At least Nessie wasn't with her, which meant he wouldn't have to hear everything twice. Jessie settled herself at his kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea. She took a long sip before speaking, clearly savouring the drama of the moment. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about whether anyone had disagreements with Euphemia, and I remembered something." "Go on," Hamish prompted, sitting down across from her. "It was about 3 weeks ago at the kirk. I'd stayed late to arrange flowers for Sunday service. I heard voices coming from the vestry, raised voices. One was Euphemia, and she sounded distressed." "Could you hear what was being said?" "Not clearly, no, but I heard her say something about children, about how some things couldn't be undone, and then she said, 'I won't let it stay buried any longer.' Those were her exact words." "Did you see who she was talking to?" Jessie shook her head. "I thought about going to see if she needed help, but then the door opened and she came out alone. Her face was flushed and she looked upset. When she saw me, she tried to compose herself, but I could tell she'd been crying." "Did she say anything to you?" "Only that she was tired and was going home. But Hamish, there's something else. Years ago, when Euphemia first came to Loch Dubh, there was talk. People wondered why a midwife in her prime would leave a good position in Inverness to retire to a small village where her skills wouldn't be needed." "What sort of talk?" Jessie leaned forward conspiratorially. "Some said there had been trouble. A baby that died, or perhaps a baby that disappeared. The stories varied, but the gist was that something had happened that made her leave her profession. She never spoke of it, and after a while people stopped asking. But it was always there, you know, like a shadow." After Jessie left, Hamish sat thinking. A baby that died or disappeared, a midwife who fled her profession, and now, decades later, a cryptic warning about emptying a cradle and letting buried things come to light. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though its exact shape remained unclear. He telephoned the General Register Office in Edinburgh and spent an hour navigating bureaucracy before being connected to someone who could help him access old birth and death records from Inverness. He provided dates and Euphemia's name, requesting any records that might be relevant to cases she'd been involved in. While waiting for the records to be compiled and sent, Hamish decided to visit Jessie's sister Nessie, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of village history. If anyone knew the old stories about Euphemia, it would be her. He found Nessie in her cottage, knitting what appeared to be a scarf of alarming length and dubious utility. "Hamish Macbeth," she said, setting down her knitting. "I've been expecting you." "Have you now?" Hamish said, taking off his cap and sitting in the chair she indicated. "Jessie said you were asking about Euphemia's past. I remember when she first came to Lochdub. I was younger then, of course, but old enough to notice things." "What did you notice?" "She was haunted, that's what she was. Oh, she put on a good face, joined the kirk, made herself useful. But I'd see her sometimes walking alone by the loch, and she'd have this look about her, like someone carrying a heavy burden." "Did she ever mention her work as a midwife?" Nessie's needles clicked as she resumed her knitting. "Never directly, but once, years ago, there was a young woman in the village who got herself in trouble, if you understand my meaning. Unmarried and expecting. Her family wanted to send her away, have the baby adopted, but Euphemia intervened." "How?" "She spoke to the girl's parents, convinced them to let her keep the baby. She said something I'll never forget. She said, 'Some cradles must stay full, and some women must have the chance to be mothers.' It was an odd thing to say, and the way she said it, with such passion, made me think she was speaking from personal experience." "Did the girl keep the baby?" "She did. Married the father eventually, moved to Inverness. But Euphemia's words stuck with me. Some cradles must stay full. Now, all these years later, she was saying the cradle must be emptied. It's as if she'd changed her mind about something fundamental." Hamish felt the pieces shifting in his mind, beginning to form a picture. "Nessie, do you remember Euphemia ever becoming upset when certain topics were mentioned?" "Oh, aye, adoption, for one, and anything to do with children born outside of marriage. She'd become quite agitated, though she tried to hide it. Once, at a church social, someone made a joke about illegitimate children, and Euphemia left the room. Mrs. Wellington had to go after her." After leaving Nessie's cottage, Hamish returned to the kirk. The building was empty except for a cleaning woman who nodded to him and continued her work. He made his way to the vestry and stood looking at the cradle again. The small baby gown was safely stored as evidence, but Hamish wondered if there might be other items hidden away. He examined the cradle more thoroughly this time, running his hands along every surface, checking for loose boards or hidden compartments. At the very bottom, beneath where the straw had been, he found them. Scratches in the wood, shallow but deliberate. Names and dates carved carefully into the base of the cradle where they wouldn't normally be seen. He pulled out his mobile phone and used its light to read them clearly. There were 3 sets of initials with dates beside them, spanning a period from 1967 to 1974. All the dates were in autumn and winter. All the dates were roughly 9 months apart from each other. Hamish photographed the markings and left the kirk deep in thought. He needed to cross-reference these dates with birth records from Inverness, see if they matched any of the cases Euphemia had handled. Back at the police station, he found a message waiting from the register office. They'd found several records matching the time frame and Euphemia's involvement. 3 in particular stood out. Babies born to unmarried mothers, all of whom had given their children up for adoption. The dates matched the ones carved into the cradle, but there was more. In each case, there had been questions raised about the adoptions. Nothing proven, nothing official, but notes in the files suggesting irregularities. One mother had later tried to reclaim her child and been told the adoption records were sealed. Another had claimed she'd been coerced into signing the papers. The third had simply disappeared after giving birth, leaving no forwarding address. Hamish sat back in his chair, the full weight of what he was uncovering settling over him. Euphemia hadn't just been a midwife. She'd been involved in something darker, something that had apparently haunted her for decades. The telephone rang, making him jump. It was Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife and one of the gentler souls in Lochdub. "Hamish, I've just remembered something about Euphemia. I don't know if it's important, but after what's happened, I thought you should know." "What is it, Angela?" "Last month she came to see me. We had tea, and she seemed troubled. She said she wanted to ask my advice about confessing a sin. She said she had done something long ago that she regretted terribly, something that had hurt innocent people. She wanted to know if it was ever too late to make amends. What did you tell her? I said it's never too late for truth and reconciliation, but she seemed doubtful. She said some truths, once revealed, would hurt more people than they'd help. Then she changed the subject and we spoke of other things, but Hamish, I had the feeling she was planning something, some kind of revelation. After Angela rang off, Hamish stared at the evidence spread across his desk. The baby gown, the photographs of the carved names, the adoption records with their troubling irregularities. Euphemia Grant had been preparing to confess something, to empty the cradle of its secrets. And someone had killed her to keep those secrets buried. The question was, who stood to lose the most if the truth came out? Hamish looked at his list of potential suspects. It was time to start asking harder questions, to probe into old wounds and buried histories. Outside, the sleet had turned to snow, soft and silent, covering the village in white. But beneath the peaceful exterior, Hamish knew, lay secrets as dark and cold as the winter earth. Chapter 4. Old Stories Stirred Up. The snow had settled into a proper Highland blizzard by the time Hamish set out to interview his first suspect. Margaret Boyd lived in a small stone cottage on the outskirts of Lochdubb, a place that always seemed to project an air of sadness, as if the very walls remembered grief. Margaret answered the door on the third knock, her face pinched and wary. She was a thin woman in her 60s, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that held no warmth. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I suppose someone's been talking." "About what, Mrs. Boyd?" Hamish asked, though he already knew the answer. "About my baby, about Euphemia Grant and what happened 30 years ago." Margaret's voice was bitter. "You'd best sit down, Constable. It's a long story and not a pleasant one." The cottage interior was spotless but cheerless, decorated with the sort of rigid propriety that suggested a woman who'd spent years trying to present an acceptable face to the world. Margaret brought tea in a pot that looked as if it had never been used for anything but formal occasions. "My daughter was born in January of 1995, Margaret began, her hands trembling slightly as she poured. "She lived for 3 days. They said it was a heart defect, something that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. But I never believed it." "Why not?" "Because Euphemia Grant was there. She was working privately by then, helping women who couldn't afford regular medical care or who wanted discretion. I was neither poor nor seeking discretion, but my sister recommended her, said she was skilled and kind." Margaret's laugh was harsh. Kind. That woman didn't know the meaning of the word. "What happened?" "The birth was difficult. My daughter was born blue, not breathing properly. Euphemia worked on her, got her breathing, but she was weak. She said the baby needed to go to hospital immediately, but I was exhausted, bleeding. By the time we got there, it was too late. My daughter died in my arms." "I'm sorry," Hamish said, and meant it. Euphemia said all the right things, made all the appropriate noises, but I saw something in her eyes, something that haunted me for years. Guilt, perhaps, or knowledge of something she wouldn't share. When I tried to get the medical records later to understand what had gone wrong, there were irregularities, missing pages, unclear notes, as if someone had tried to hide something. "Did you ever confront Mrs. Grant about this?" "Once, years ago, when she first moved to Lochdubb. I saw her at the kirk and I asked her directly if she had been responsible for my daughter's death. She went pale as milk and said she'd done everything she could, but that some cradles must stay empty. Those were her exact words. Some cradles must stay empty, as if my child's death had been predestined, meant to be." Hamish thought of the carved names in the cradle, the pattern of adoptions and irregularities. "Mrs. Boyd, where were you on the evening of December 19th? Margaret's expression hardened. "You're asking if I killed her. I won't pretend I didn't hate her, Constable. I did, but I didn't kill her. I was at home that evening alone. I have no alibi, if that's what you're asking, but I didn't poison her, no matter how much I might have wanted to. Hamish's next visit was to Ian Macpherson, who worked at the petrol station and lived above it in a small flat. Ian was in his early 50s, a big man with work-roughened hands and a face that showed the wear of hard living. "Euphemia Grant," Ian said when Hamish explained his purpose. "Aye, I heard she was dead. Can't say I'm sorry." "That's a harsh statement, Mr. Macpherson. Harsh but honest. That woman destroyed my family, or near enough. My mother was 17 when she got pregnant with me. Unmarried, scared, from a good family that couldn't bear the shame. Euphemia Grant convinced her to give me up for adoption. But you're here, you know your mother. The adoption didn't go through." "It nearly did. My mother signed the papers, everything was arranged. But at the last moment, my grandmother intervened. She'd seen what the adoption had done to my mother, how it was breaking her. My grandmother took me in, raised me while my mother recovered. But the damage was done. My mother never fully got over it, the guilt of what she'd almost done. She died 5 years ago, still carrying that burden." "Did you blame Mrs. Grant for that?" "Of course I did. She preyed on vulnerable women, convinced them to give up their babies. Oh, she probably thought she was doing good, finding homes for children born in scandal. But she never considered the cost, never thought about the mothers who spent the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to their children." "Did you ever speak to her about this?" "Once, about a month ago. I saw her in the village and all that old anger just came boiling up. I told her she had ruined lives, that she had blood on her hands. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She just looked at me with these sad eyes and said, 'I know. God forgive me, I know.'" "And that was the extent of your conversation?" "Aye. She walked away, and that was the last time I spoke to her." Hamish made notes, his mind working through the implications. "Where were you on the evening of December 19th? "Working. I had the late shift at the station, 6 until midnight. You can check the logs if you like." Father Alistair Munro was the youngest of Hamish's suspects, an earnest man in his 30s who had only been in Loch for 2 years. He received Hamish in the small sitting room of the chapel house, offering tea with an anxious courtesy that suggested he knew why Hamish had come. "I heard about Euphemia," he said, his hands clasped tightly together. "It's terrible. I've been praying for her soul." "I understand you and Mrs. Grant had a disagreement recently," Hamish said, deciding to be direct. Father Munro flushed. It wasn't really a disagreement, more of a theological discussion that became somewhat heated. I'd suggested a joint Christmas service combining the traditions of both our congregations. I thought it would be a gesture of unity. Euphemia was very much against it. How against it? She was quite adamant. She said traditions existed for a reason, that they shouldn't be diluted or compromised. I tried to explain that I wasn't suggesting we abandon tradition, merely expand it, but she became quite upset, said that some things, once broken, could never be mended. It seemed an extreme reaction to what I thought was a reasonable proposal. "Did she say anything else?" Father Munro hesitated. "She said something odd. She said, 'You don't understand what happens when sacred things are tampered with, when the natural order is disrupted. I've seen it, Father. I've lived with the consequences.' I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I still don't." After leaving the chapel house, Hamish returned to the police station to find Lorna McAllister waiting for him, a folder in her hands. "I've brought you the financial records from the Kirk," she said. "You'd mentioned wanting to see if there were any unusual transactions. I thought this might help." Hamish accepted the folder gratefully. "That's very thorough of you, Mrs. McAllister." "I want to help find who did this, Hamish. Euphemia deserves justice." Lorna's voice was steady, but her eyes were red-rimmed. "Have you learned anything? Are you closer to finding the killer?" "I'm making progress," Hamish said carefully. "Several people had reasons to resent Mrs. Grant, it seems. She had a complicated past." "She did," Lorna agreed. "But whatever she'd done, she was trying to make amends. I'm certain of all it. She was a good woman at heart." After Lorna left, Hamish spread his notes across his desk. 3 suspects, 3 motives, all connected to Euphemia's past work as a midwife. Margaret Boyd's dead daughter. Ian Macpherson's nearly adopted past. Father Munro's theological dispute. But which of them, if any, had been desperate enough to commit murder? And why now, after all these years? Hamish stared at the evidence, feeling that he was close to something important, but couldn't quite see it clearly. The answer was there, hidden among the facts, waiting to be discovered. Outside, the snow continued to fall and Christmas drew inexorably closer. Chapter 5, Christmas Grudges. The records from Edinburgh arrived by courier the next morning, a thick envelope that Hamish opened with a sense of foreboding. Inside were photocopies of documents dating back to the 1960s and 1970s, testimony transcripts from a case that had never made it to full trial. Hamish settled at his kitchen table with a pot of strong coffee and began to read. Luggs, sensing this was serious business, abandoned his usual begging routine and lay quietly by the fire. The case had involved a private maternity home in Inverness, run by a Mrs. Daphne Forrester, and staffed by several midwives, including Euphemia Grant. Between 1967 and 1974, the home had facilitated dozens of adoptions, all involving unmarried mothers from respectable families. On the surface, everything had appeared legitimate. But in 1974, questions had been raised. A young woman named Catherine Ross had tried to reclaim her son, only to be told the adoption was sealed and irreversible. She'd hired a solicitor who'd begun investigating. What he'd uncovered had been troubling. Adoption processed with unusual speed, documentation that seemed incomplete, and mothers who'd later claimed they'd been coerced or misled about the permanence of their decisions. Euphemia Grant had been called to testify. According to the transcript, she'd admitted to participating in the adoptions but claimed she'd believed everything was being done legally. She testified that Mrs. Forrester had told the midwives the mothers had all signed proper consent forms, that the adoptive families had been thoroughly vetted. When pressed about specific cases, Euphemia had broken down on the stand. She'd said she'd begun to have doubts, that some of the mothers had seemed confused about what they were signing, that the paperwork had sometimes been completed after the babies had already been placed. But by then, it had been too late to stop the process. The case had been settled quietly before trial. Mrs. Forrester had lost her licence, the maternity home had closed, and the midwives had been censured but not prosecuted. The adoptions had stood, deemed to be in the best interests of the children involved. Hamish put down the papers and rubbed his eyes. No wonder Euphemia had left her profession. No wonder she'd carried guilt for decades. He was still pondering this when the telephone rang. It was Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, his superior officer and perpetual thorn in Hamish's side. "Macbeth! What's this I hear about a murder in your wee village? Why wasn't I informed immediately?" "I filed a report yesterday, sir," Hamish said patiently. "You should have received it." "Don't get cheeky with me, laddie. I'm coming down there to take charge of this investigation. Can't have a village bobby mucking about with a serious crime." Hamish suppressed a sigh. Blair's involvement would mean complications, interference, and probably a thorough examination of the police, station's whiskey supply. "That's not necessary, sir. I have the situation well in hand. I'll be the judge of that. Expect me tomorrow morning." After Blair rang off, Hamish decided he needed to make as much progress as possible before his superior arrived. He drove through the snowy roads to Margaret Boyd's cottage, finding her in her garden despite the cold, cutting back dead roses with methodical precision. "Mrs. Boyd, I need to ask you some more questions about your daughter's death." Margaret's pruning shears paused. "What more is there to say?" "Your daughter died in January 1995. That was several years after Euphemia Grant stopped working as a midwife officially. How did you come to hire her?" "My sister had used her. Said she was discreet and experienced. I didn't know about her past then, about the maternity home and the adoptions. I only found out later when I was trying to understand what had gone wrong." "When you learned about the adoptions, did you think your daughter's death might be connected?" Margaret's face twisted with old pain. "I thought perhaps she'd been careless, distracted by guilt, or perhaps she'd wanted my baby to die as some kind of twisted penance for the children she'd taken from their mothers. I know that sounds mad, but grief makes you think terrible things." "Mrs. Boyd, I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you have any contact with Euphemia Grant beyond that one confrontation you mentioned?" Margaret was silent for a long moment. "I went to see her. About 2 weeks ago. I'd heard through the village grapevine that she was planning something, that she'd been talking about making amends. I wanted to know if that included finally telling me the truth about my daughter's death." "What did she say?" "She invited me in, made me tea. She told me she was sorry, that she had done her best for my baby, but it hadn't been enough. She said she'd carried the guilt of every child she couldn't save, but that my daughter's death had been natural, nothing she could have prevented. She showed me her old notes from that night, everything she had written down. It was all there, the attempts at resuscitation, the timeline, the decisions made." "Did you believe her?" "I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. But 30 years of anger doesn't disappear in an afternoon. I told her I'd think about what she'd said and left. That was the last time I saw her alive." Hamish's next stop was the petrol station, where he found Ian Macpherson changing the oil in a battered Land Rover. The man looked up as Hamish approached, his expression guarded. "You again?" "I need to verify your alibi for the night of December 19th, Mr. Macpherson." "I told you I was working. Check the security tapes if you don't believe me." "I did check them. You clocked in at 6, but the camera shows you leaving the shop at 9:30 and not returning until 11:15, nearly 2 hours unaccounted for." Ian's jaw tightened. "I went for supplies. We'd run low on cigarettes and lottery tickets. I drove to the all-night shop in Breakey." "That's quite a drive. Must have been urgent." "It was quiet. No customers. I thought I had time." Ian set down his wrench and faced Hamish directly. "I didn't go to the Kirk, and I didn't poison Euphemia Grant. I may have hated what she'd done, but I wouldn't kill an old woman." "Did you know she was planning to confess publicly about the adoptions?" Ian's expression shifted to surprise. "No. How would I know that?" "Someone did. Someone who had reason to want those secrets to stay buried." Back at the police station, Hamish found a message from Father Munro, asking him to come to the chapel house. The priest met him at the door, his face troubled. "I've been praying about this, Constable, and I believe I need to tell you something. It's been weighing on my conscience." They sat in the same small sitting room as before. Father Munro clasped his hands together as if seeking strength. "After my disagreement with Euphemia, I went back to apologise. It was late, perhaps 9 o'clock. I saw lights in the kirk and went in. Euphemia was there in the vestry. She wasn't alone. Who was with her? I couldn't see clearly. The door was only partly open, and I didn't want to intrude. But I heard voices. 2 women. They were arguing. Euphemia said something about the truth must come out, and the other woman said, 'You'll destroy everything.' Then I heard crying. I felt I shouldn't eavesdrop, so I left." "You didn't recognise the other voice?" "It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. I thought it might not be relevant." Hamish drove back through the darkening afternoon, his mind churning. 2 women arguing in the vestry. Someone who knew about Euphemia's plans, someone who stood to lose everything if the truth came out. He thought about the suspects, about Margaret's visit to Euphemia, about Ian's gap in his alibi, about the unknown woman Father Munro had heard. The pieces were there, but they hadn't yet formed a complete picture. At the police station, Lorna McAllister was waiting again, this time with a thermos of soup and a concerned expression. "You've been running yourself ragged, Hamish. You need to eat properly." As Hamish accepted the soup gratefully, he studied Lorna. She'd been there at every turn, helpful and cooperative. She'd known Euphemia better than anyone. She'd been the one to discover the body, and she'd said Euphemia was like a mother to her. A thought began to form in Hamish's mind, troubling and persistent. What if the truth Euphemia planned to reveal wasn't just about other people's children? What if it was about Lorna herself? Chapter 6. False Blessings. Detective Chief Inspector Blair arrived in Lockdube the next morning like a force of nature, all bluster and bad temper. He emerged from his car, brushed snow off his overcoat with theatrical irritation, and fixed Hamish with a baleful glare. "Right then, Macbeth. Show me what you've got, and it better be more than your usual Highland nonsense." Hamish led him into the police station, where he'd prepared a comprehensive summary of his findings. Blair settled into the chair behind Hamish's desk, a presumptuous claim of authority that Hamish let pass without comment. "So you've got 3 suspects," Blair said, leafing through the reports. "All with motives, none with solid alibis. Not bad for a village bobby, I suppose, though you've probably missed something obvious." "I'm still pursuing certain lines of inquiry, sir." "What you mean is you haven't got a clue who did it." Blair leaned back, looking smug. "Well, lucky for you, I'm here to sort this mess out. I'll interview these suspects properly. None of your gentle Highland chat, real police work." Hamish suppressed a sigh and went to make tea, a diplomatic retreat that would keep Blair occupied and out of trouble for a few hours. When he returned with the tray, he found Blair on the telephone, already arranging to bring Margaret Boyd in for formal questioning. The interrogation, conducted at Blair's insistence in the police station rather than Margaret's home, was predictably heavy-handed. Blair blustered and threatened, suggesting Margaret had poisoned Euphemia in revenge for her daughter's death. Margaret, to her credit, remained composed. "I was at home alone that evening," she repeated for the 3rd time. "I have no witnesses to that fact, but it's the truth. I had no reason to kill Euphemia. She'd already told me what I needed to know about my daughter's death." "Convenient that she's not alive to confirm your story, poor," Blair sneered. "Actually, sir," Hamish interjected, "I've been in contact with Mrs. Boyd's sister in Wick. She telephoned Margaret on the evening of the 19th at approximately 8:30. They spoke for nearly an hour. The phone records confirm it." Blair's face reddened. "Why didn't you mention this before?" "I only received confirmation this morning, sir. I was waiting for the records from the telephone company." After Margaret left, vindicated and visibly relieved, Blair turned his attention to Ian Macpherson. The petrol station owner was less patient with Blair's bombast than Margaret had been. "I've already told Constable Macbeth everything," Ian said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I was at work. I left for supplies, but I went to Brakey, not to the Kirk." "Can anyone confirm that?" "The shop assistant in Brakey. Young lad named Danny MacLeod. He'll remember me because I bought enough cigarettes to keep the shop stocked for a while." Hamish made a note to check this, though he suspected it would prove accurate. Blair, sensing his case was weakening, pressed harder. "You admitted you confronted Mrs. Grant a month ago, or you told her she had blood on her hands." "And she agreed with me. She wasn't defensive or angry. She just looked sad and said she knew. What kind of guilty conscience kills someone for speaking the truth they already believe?" After Ian departed, Hamish quietly made a call to the shop in Brakey. The assistant confirmed Ian's story, even providing the exact time he'd been there, 9:40 to 10:15. The timing made it virtually impossible for Ian to have been at the Kirk when Euphemia died. Blair's interrogation of Father Munro was briefer but no less aggressive. The young priest listened to Blair's accusations with an expression of patient suffering that suggested years of theological training and forbearance. "I had a theological disagreement with Mrs. Grant," Father Munro said calmly. "That hardly constitutes a motive for murder, and as I've already told Constable Macbeth, I was celebrating evening mass that night from 7 to 8, followed by confession until 9:30. My parishioners can confirm my presence." "Parishioners lie for priests," Blair said darkly. "Perhaps in detective novels, Chief Inspector. But I can assure you my congregation takes the commandment against bearing false witness quite seriously." After Father Munro left, Blair slumped in his chair, deflated. "Well, that's just grand. 3 suspects and not one of them did it. What kind of investigation have you been running, Macbeth?" "The kind that eliminates the innocent to focus on the guilty, sir. Don't get clever with me. If these 3 didn't do it, who did?" Hamish had been asking himself the same question all morning. The answer kept circling back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. "I need to do more digging into Mrs. Grant's personal papers, sir. With your permission, I'd like to search her cottage. Fine, and make it quick. I want this case wrapped up before Christmas. Can't have tourists thinking Lochdoub's some sort of murder capital. Euphemia Grant's cottage was a neat, modest dwelling on a quiet street. Lorna McAllister met Hamish there with the keys, her expression troubled. I can't believe any of those people would have killed her, she said as she unlocked the door. Margaret, Ian, Father Munro. They're all decent people despite their grievances. Sometimes decent people do terrible things, when pushed hard enough, Hamish said, though he was beginning to doubt that any of them had been pushed quite hard enough for murder. The cottage interior was precisely what Hamish had expected. Clean, orderly, filled with the religious texts and photographs of the kirk. But in Euphemia's small study he found something more revealing, a locked drawer in her desk. "Do you have a key for this?" he asked Lorna. No, Euphemia kept that locked. I assumed it was just personal papers, nothing important. Hamish picked the simple lock, a skill he'd acquired during his years of police work. Inside the drawer were letters, dozens of them, some dating back decades. He began to read. They were from mothers, women whose babies had been adopted through the Inverness maternity home. Some were angry, demanding to know where their children were. Others were pleading, begging for information, for contact, for forgiveness. A few were grateful, thanking Euphemia for helping them when they had had nowhere else to turn. But one set of letters stood out. They were from a woman named Catherine McAllister, dated from 1972 to 1975. The early letters were formal, asking about the adoption process, about the welfare of the child she'd given up. The later letters grew increasingly desperate. "I need to know my daughter is well," one read. "I need to know she's loved and cared for. Please, Euphemia, I'm begging you. Just tell me she's happy." The final letter, dated March 1975, was brief and heartbreaking. "I'm dying. Please bring my daughter to see me before I go. I need to hold her one more time. Her name is Lorna. Tell her I never wanted to give her away." Hamish looked up to find Lorna standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew Euphemia had arranged your adoption." Lorna's hands trembled. "Not until recently. I thought my mother had died in childbirth, that Euphemia had taken me in out of kindness. That's what I'd always been told." "When did you find out the truth?" 2 weeks ago. I was helping Euphemia with some paperwork and found these letters. I confronted her, and she confessed everything. My mother didn't die in childbirth. She was a 17-year-old girl who was pressured into giving me up. Euphemia had told her I'd go to a good family, but instead she'd kept me herself, raised me as her niece. Why would she do that? Guilt, perhaps, or love. By the time my mother asked to see me, I was 3 years old. Euphemia couldn't bear to give me up, so she lied. She told my mother I'd been placed with a family abroad, that contact was impossible. My mother died believing I was living a happy life somewhere, never knowing I was right there in Inverness, being raised by the woman who'd stolen me. Hamish felt a wave of sadness. That must have been devastating to learn. It was. Lorna's voice was barely above a whisper. But Euphemia was the only mother I'd ever known. Whatever she'd done, she'd loved me, raised me well. I couldn't hate her for it. I just wanted to understand why. "Is that what you were arguing about in the vestry?" Father Munro heard 2 women arguing the night she died. Lorna nodded slowly. "She told me she was going to confess everything publicly. She was going to tell the church elders about all the adoptions, all the mothers she'd lied to, including my mother. She said she needed to make amends before she died, even if it meant destroying the life we'd built together." Hamish studied her carefully. "And you couldn't let that happen?" "No," Lorna said. "I couldn't." Chapter 7. The Devoted Volunteer. Hamish gestured for Lorna to sit down, his mind racing. The admission hung in the air between them, ambiguous and damning. He needed to tread carefully now to understand the full picture before making accusations that couldn't be taken back. "Tell me everything," he said gently. "From the beginning." Lorna sank into Euphemia's favourite chair, her hands gripping the armrests as if seeking support from the woman who was no longer there. I was born in January 1972 in the maternity home in Inverness. My mother was Catherine McAllister, 17 years old and terrified. Her family had money but no tolerance for scandal. They sent her to Euphemia, who promised to arrange a quiet adoption to a respectable family. But that's not what happened. No. Euphemia had been facilitating adoptions for years by then, always believing she was doing the right thing. But when I was born, something changed. My mother held me for 3 days, nursed me, named me. Then Euphemia took me away, promising I'd go to a good home. But instead of finding adoptive parents, she kept me. Why? Lorna's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if even Euphemia understood why. Perhaps she'd seen too many babies torn from their mothers. Perhaps she wanted a child of her own. She told my mother I'd been placed with a family in Canada, that contact would be impossible. Then she moved to a different part of Inverness, claimed I was her sister's child, orphaned in a car accident. No one questioned it. And your mother? She wrote letters for 3 years, begging for news. Euphemia responded occasionally, inventing stories about how well I was doing in my new life. When my mother was dying, she begged to see me one last time. Euphemia refused, said it would be too traumatic for everyone involved. My mother died believing I was thousands of miles away. Hamish felt the weight of this tragedy, the layers of deception and misguided love. When did Euphemia retire to Lochdub? When I was 8. She said we needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet where people wouldn't ask questions. She told everyone here the same story, that I was her orphaned niece, and I believed it, Hamish. For 43 years I believed every word. Until you found the letters. I was helping her organise her papers. She'd been acting strangely for weeks, talking about making amends, about clearing her conscience. I found the lock drawer and I just knew somehow that it contained something important. When she was out, I picked the lock. Lorna's voice broke. I found my mother's letters, all of them. I read about her desperation, her grief, her death. And I realised the woman I'd called Aunt Euphemia, the woman who'd been my entire world, had stolen me from my real mother. How did you confront her? I waited until we were alone in the kirk. It was late evening, the 19th of December. I showed her the letters and demanded the truth. She confessed, everything crying, begging for forgiveness. She said she'd loved me so much she couldn't bear to give me up, that she'd convinced herself she was doing what was best for me. What did you say? I was furious. I told her she had robbed me of my mother, robbed my mother of me. All those years, all those lies. She could have told me the truth at any time after I was grown, but she kept the secret, kept me ignorant. And now my mother was dead and I'd never know her, never have the chance to explain that I hadn't abandoned her willingly. Hamish listened, his heart heavy. She told you about her plan to confess publicly, Stoia. Yes, she said she was going to tell the church elders everything, submit a written statement about all the adoptions, all the mothers who'd been lied to. She said it was the only way to make peace with God, even if it meant destroying her reputation and hurting me. I begged her not to. I said it would serve no purpose except to cause pain, but she was adamant. Did you threaten her? No! Lorna looked horrified. I was angry, yes, but I could never harm her. She was still my mother in every way that mattered. She'd raised me, loved me, sacrificed for me. However it began, her love for me was real. Then what happened? We argued for nearly an hour. Finally, I left. I told her I needed time to think, to process everything. She said she understood, that she'd give me a few days before making her confession, but she was adamant it had to be done before Christmas Eve. Something about the symbolism, about the cradle being empty, about truth being born at Christmas. Hamish studied her face, looking for signs of deception. You were the last person to see her alive. I suppose I was. I left the kirk around 9:30. Euphemia was still in the vestry, sitting beside that damned cradle. She looked so old, so tired. I wanted to comfort her, but I couldn't. I was too angry, too hurt. Did you see anyone else at the kirk that evening? No. The building was empty except for us. And after you left, where did you go? Home. I live alone, so I have no alibi. I spent the night crying, trying to understand how my entire life had been built on a lie. Hamish leaned forward. Mrs. McAllister, I need to ask you directly. Did you poison Euphemia Grant? Lorna met his eyes steadily. No, Hamish. I swear on everything I hold sacred, I did not kill her. I was angry, I was hurt, but I loved her. She was my mother, the only one I'd ever known. There was a commotion at the cottage door, and Blair burst in, his face flushed with triumph. Macbeth! I've just been speaking with the chemist in Strathbane. Guess who purchased aconite-based rat poison 3 months ago? Mrs. Lorna McAllister. Lorna's face went white. That was for the kirk. We had rats in the vestry. Euphemia asked me to get something to deal with them. Very convenient, Blair sneered. You had access to the poison. Opportunity and motive. I'd say we have our killer. Wait, Hamish said, his mind working furiously. Something didn't fit. Sir? If Mrs. McAllister wanted to kill Euphemia to keep her quiet, why do it that very night? Euphemia had promised to give her a few days. Why not take time to establish an alibi, to plan it properly? Crimes of passion aren't planned, Macbeth. She snapped, but Hamish wasn't convinced. Lorna's grief seemed genuine, her shock at Euphemia's death real. And there was something else, something nagging at the edge of his consciousness. Mrs. McAllister, he said slowly, when you left the kirk that night, did Euphemia lock the door behind you? I don't know. I assumed she would when she left. But you said she was still in the vestry when you departed. She was sitting beside the cradle. Yes. Then how did the killer get in? The door was locked when you discovered the body the next morning. You had to use your key. Lorna frowned. I assumed Euphemia had locked it when she left that night. But what if she didn't leave? What if someone came after you departed? Someone who had their own key? Blair scoffed. Half the village has keys to that kirk. What's your point? My point, sir, is that the killer had to have a key, and they had to know Euphemia would still be there late that night. They had to know about the cradle, about what it meant to her. This wasn't a random crime. It was calculated. Hamish looked at Lorna. Who else knew about the cradle restoration? Who else had been helping with it? Several people. Mrs. Wellington, some of the church volunteers. Lorna paused, but I was the one who coordinated everything. I was the one who knew Euphemia's schedule, who knew she'd taken to staying late at the kirk. The implication hung heavy in the air. Blair's expression turned smug. Sounds like a confession to me. No, Hamish said, but doubt had crept into his voice. Everything pointed to Lorna, the motive, the means, the opportunity. And yet something still didn't fit. He thought of the cradle, of Euphemia's cryptic words, of the careful carving of names beneath the straw. The answer was there, somewhere in the details. He just needed to see it clearly. Mrs. McAllister, he said quietly, going to have to ask you to come down to the station. We have more questions that need answering. Lorna stood, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. I understand, but Hamish, please believe me, whatever else I may be, I am not a murderer. As they left Euphemia's cottage, Hamish glanced back at the neat, tidy rooms, at the evidence of a life lived in careful penance. Somewhere in this cottage, in these papers and letters and memories, was the final piece of the puzzle. He just had to find it before Blair's eagerness for an arrest overrode the truth. Chapter 8. The Cradle's Secret. Hamish sat in his kitchen long after Blair had driven back to Strathbane, taking Lorna with him for further questioning. The DCI had been certain of guilt, ready to file charges within hours, but Hamish had persuaded him to wait until morning, to give him one more night to verify the facts. Luggs watched from his spot by the fire as Hamish spread documents across the table. Euphemia's letters, photographs of the carved names, witness statements, timelines. Everything pointed to Lorna, yet Hamish's instincts rebelled against the obvious conclusion. He thought about the woman he'd known for years. Lorna McAllister was steady, reliable, devoted to the kirk and the community. She'd organised countless church functions, cared for elderly parishioners, taught Sunday school. Was she capable of murder? Yes, came the uncomfortable answer. Anyone was capable of murder given sufficient provocation. The question was whether Lorna had actually done it. Hamish picked up his notes from the scene. Euphemia had been found in the vestry, teacup beside her. The poison had been in the tea, but who had made the tea? Euphemia always brought her own flask, according to Lorna. Yet no flask had been found at the scene. He telephoned to Dalrymple, catching her just as she was preparing for bed. "The teacup," he said without preamble. "Was there a teapot or flask found near the body?" "No flask, just the single cup half full. Why?" "Euphemia always brought her own tea. If there was no flask, someone else must have prepared that cup for her." "Or she disposed of the flask herself before drinking the poisoned tea," Dalrymple suggested, "though that seems unlikely if she didn't know it was poisoned." After ringing off, Hamish sat thinking. Something Lorna had said earlier echoed in his mind. Euphemia had been adamant about confessing before Christmas Eve, about the symbolism of the empty cradle, about truth being born at Christmas. He pulled out his photographs of the carved names again, studying them in the lamplight. 3 sets of initials, 3 dates. Children taken from their mothers and placed in adoptions that may not have been entirely legal or ethical. Euphemia had carried guilt over these cases for decades. But why carve the names in the cradle? Why hide them where they might never be found? Unless she'd meant for them to be found, unless the carved names were part of her planned confession, physical evidence of what she'd done. Hamish stood abruptly, startling Luggs. "Come on, boy, we're going to the kirk." The village was dark and silent, Christmas lights twinkling in windows. The kirk loomed against the starry sky, its stone walls solid and enduring. Hamish let himself in with his key, switching on lights as he made his way to the vestry. The cradle stood where it had been throughout the investigation, now taped off as evidence. Hamish carefully removed the tape and lifted the cradle, turning it over, to examine the carved names once more. He photographed them again from different angles, making sure he had clear images of each marking. Then he noticed something he had missed before. The carving wasn't uniform. 2 of the sets of initials were deep and clear, obviously old, but the 3rd set was shallower, fresher. Someone had added it recently. Hamish felt excitement building. He pulled out his mobile and called the Edinburgh Records office, reaching the night service. "I need birth records cross-referenced with adoption records for January 1972. Specifically, I'm looking for a Catherine McAllister and her daughter Lorna." It took 20 minutes, but the clerk found the record. "Baby girl born January 15th and 72 to Catherine McAllister. No adoption finalised. Child's whereabouts listed as with maternal relative. No adoption finalised," Hamish repeated. "You're certain?" "Quite certain. The file notes that Mrs. Grant claimed to have placed the child with family, so formal adoption proceedings were deemed unnecessary." Hamish thanked her and ended the call, his mind racing. Lorna hadn't been officially adopted. Euphemia had simply taken her, claiming she was a niece, which meant legally, morally, Lorna had always belonged to her birth mother. Euphemia's crime wasn't facilitating an illegal adoption, it was kidnapping. And that changed everything. If Euphemia confessed the truth publicly, Lorna wouldn't just learn she'd been adopted. She'd learn she'd been stolen, that Euphemia had committed a crime and lied about it for over 40 years. The woman Lorna had called her aunt, the woman she'd devoted her life to serving, would be revealed as a kidnapper. That was a motive for murder far stronger than simple anger over a planned confession. But something still nagged at Hamish. He looked at the cradle again, at the fresh carving of the 3rd set of initials. Why would Euphemia have carved Lorna's initials so recently if she'd kept this secret for decades? He examined the carving more closely, using his phone's light. The initials were LM, Lorna McAllister, but they were followed by a date, December 19th, 2024, the day Euphemia died. Hamish's blood ran cold. Euphemia hadn't carved these initials. Someone else had on the day of her death. Someone who wanted to ensure that Lorna's name was linked to the other stolen children, that Euphemia's confession would include proof of what she'd done to Lorna specifically. But who? And why? He thought back through the timeline. Lorna had argued with Euphemia and left at 9:30. Euphemia had been found dead the next morning. Between those times, someone had entered the kirk, poisoned Euphemia's tea and carved Lorna's initials in the cradle. Someone who knew about the other carved names. Someone who knew Euphemia's secret. Someone who wanted to ensure the full truth came out, even if Euphemia didn't live to confess it herself. Hamish pulled out his notes on the aconite poison. Lorna had purchased it 3 months ago for rat control, but that meant the poison had been at the kirk for months, accessible to anyone who knew where it was kept. He telephoned Lorna at the Strathbane station, where she was being held. "Mrs. McAllister, the rat poison you purchased. Where exactly did you store it at the kirk?" "In the vestry cupboard, on the top shelf. Euphemia was very particular about keeping it locked away where children couldn't reach it." "Why?" "Who else knew it was there?" "Anyone who helped with kirk maintenance, I suppose. Mrs. Wellington, the cleaning staff, some of the elders. Is this important, Hamish?" "It might be. One more question. Did Euphemia keep a spare key to the kirk hidden anywhere?" There was a pause. "Yes, under a loose stone by the back door. Several people knew about it in case of emergencies." After ending the call, Hamish stood in the vestry, piecing it together. Lorna had argued with Euphemia and left, but someone else had come later. Someone who'd known about the hidden key, about the poison in the cupboard, about Euphemia's planned confession. Someone who had wanted to ensure that confession happened, even if it meant killing Euphemia to make it so, but that made no sense. Why kill someone to ensure they confessed? Unless the confession itself wasn't the point. Unless the real goal was something else entirely. Hamish looked at the cradle, at the carved names, the carefully staged scene, and suddenly he understood. This wasn't about stopping Euphemia's confession. It was about ensuring Lorna was implicated in her death. Someone had poisoned Euphemia, carved Lorna's initials in the cradle, and arranged everything so that Lorna would be the obvious suspect. Someone who knew about the argument, about the purchase of poison, about Lorna's lack of alibi. Someone who'd been there all along, helpful and cooperative, guiding the investigation in subtle ways. Someone who stood to gain from both Euphemia's death and Lorna's arrest. Hamish closed his eyes, the full picture finally clear. He knew who the killer was, he just needed to prove it. And he needed to do it quickly, before Blair charged Lorna with a murder she didn't commit. Chapter 9. A Painful Confession. Hamish drove to Strathbane through the pre-dawn darkness, his mind working through exactly how to approach what he now knew to be true. He'd been wrong in the kirk. The fresh carving hadn't been made by someone trying to frame Lorna. It had been made by Lorna herself. She'd carved her own initials after killing Euphemia, ensuring her name would be permanently linked with the other stolen children. It was an act of claiming her identity, of asserting that she belonged among those names, even as she silenced the woman who'd stolen her from her mother. The psychology was complex, twisted by decades of lies and misplaced love, but it made a terrible sense. Blair was at the station, looking bleary-eyed and irritable. "Macbeth! What are you doing here at this ungodly hour? If you're here to argue about charging the woman, you can save your breath. The evidence is clear." "I need to speak with Mrs. McAllister alone, sir. Just a few minutes." "Why, so you can muddle the case further?" "She's guilty, Macbeth. Accept it." "Please, sir. There are details that need clarifying. Give me half an hour." Blair grumbled but eventually relented, leading Hamish to the interview room where Lorna sat. looking small and tired in the harsh fluorescent light. She'd aged years in a single night, her face drawn and pale. "Hamish," she said when he entered, "have you come to tell me I can go home?" "I'm afraid not, Mrs. McAllister." Hamish sat across from her, his voice gentle. "I've come because I need you to tell me the truth. All of it this time. I've told you everything. No. You've told me about the argument, about discovering your mother's letters, about Euphemia's plan to confess. But you haven't told me what happened after you left the Kirk that night." Lorna's hands trembled. "I went home. I was upset, confused. I needed time to think." "Except you didn't go home. Not immediately. You sat in your car for a while, didn't you? Thinking about what Euphemia's confession would mean, not just for you, but for everyone who'd known you your whole life." "I don't understand what you're implying." Hamish leaned forward. "When you found those letters, when you learned you'd been taken from your mother, you must have felt your entire identity crumbling. Everything you believed about yourself, about your place in the world, was a lie. And then Euphemia told you she was going to reveal that lie to everyone, make it public knowledge that you were stolen goods." Tears began sliding down Lorna's cheeks. "She was going to destroy me. Everything I'd built, every relationship, every achievement. People would look at me differently, treat me differently. I'd become the tragic figure, the stolen child. That's all I'd ever be." "So you went back inside?" "I sat in my car for maybe 10 minutes trying to calm down. Then I realised I'd left my gloves in the vestry. I went back in to get them." Lorna's voice was barely audible. Euphemia was still there, still sitting beside that wretched cradle. She'd made herself a cup of tea. "From her flask?" "No. She kept tea things in the vestry cupboard. A kettle, cups, tea bags. She had made herself a fresh pot. She looked up when I came in and smiled at me, that gentle smile she'd always had, and she said, 'I know this is hard, dear, but it's the right thing to do. The truth will set us both free.' But you didn't want to be free. You wanted to stay bound to the lie. I wanted to stay who I'd always been." Lorna's voice rose, then broke. "I was Lorna McAllister, respected member of the community, devoted to the Kirk and to Euphemia. I wasn't Catherine's daughter, the stolen baby, the living proof of a crime. I couldn't bear it, Hamish. I couldn't bear for that to be my identity." "What did you do?" Lorna covered her face with her hands. "The rat poison was in the cupboard. I knew where it was. I'd put it there myself. While Euphemia was looking at the cradle, praying or whatever she was doing, I put some in her tea. It was so easy. Just a few granules from the bottle. She never noticed. And then I said goodnight and left. I went home and tried to convince myself I hadn't done it, that I'd imagined it. But the next morning when I came to the Kirk for decorating and found her there, I knew I'd killed her. I'd killed the only mother I'd ever known." The silence in the interview room was profound. Hamish felt the weight of this confession, the tragedy of it. "You carved your initials in the cradle?" "Yes, after she was dead, before I called anyone. I knew about the other names she'd carved, the other stolen children. I wanted my name there too. I wanted to be part of that history, acknowledged as one of them. It was the only way I could claim my real identity while still keeping it secret from everyone else." Lorna looked up at him, her face ravaged by grief. "Does that make any sense?" "In a terrible way, yes. I loved her, Hamish. Despite everything, despite what she'd done, I loved her. She raised me, cared for me, sacrificed for me. She was my mother in every way except biology, and I killed her to preserve the lie that made her my mother." "Why not just let her make the confession? You could have dealt with the truth together." "Because I'd have lost her anyway. Once the truth was out, once people knew what she'd done, she'd no longer be my beloved Aunt Euphemia. She'd be Euphemia Grant the kidnapper, and I'd be the stolen child. Our relationship would be defined by that crime forever. At least this way, in death, She remains who she always was to me, and I remain who I've always been. Except you're now a murderer, Lorna nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I am. Strange how you can love someone so much and still kill them. I never understood how that was possible until it happened to me. Did you think you'd get away with it? I don't know. Part of me hoped you'd never figure it out, that it would remain a mystery. But another part of me wanted to be caught, wanted to confess. Carrying this secret is worse than any punishment you could give me. At least in prison, people will know why I'm there. The truth will be out, in a way. Hamish sat back, exhausted. You'll need to make a formal statement. I know. I'm ready to do that. Lorna wiped her eyes. Will they tell everyone? About Euphemia? About the adoptions? About me? I imagine it will come out during the trial. These things usually do. So she gets her confession after all, just not the way she intended. The cradle will be emptied of its secrets, and the truth will come to light. She'd probably say it was God's will that justice finds its way even when we try to stop it. Perhaps she would. Hamish, will you do something for me? Will you make sure the cradle is treated respectfully? Don't let it become some ghoulish artifact. It's just a cradle, meant to hold babies. The sins attached to it weren't its fault. I'll do what I can. Thank you. Lorna stood, her dignity somehow intact despite everything. I suppose I should speak with a solicitor now, and I should tell you where Euphemia's confession letter is. She'd written it all down, everything she planned to say. It's in her cottage, in the locked drawer of her desk. The key is on her keyring. I'll retrieve it. The letter explains everything. All the adoptions, all the lies. She names names, including mine. She was going to read it to the church elders on Christmas Eve before the midnight service. She wanted to confess in a holy space, at a holy time. She said it was the only way to make proper atonement. Blair opened the door, looking suspicious. Well, what's going on in here? Mrs. McAllister has something to tell you, sir, Hamish said quietly. I think you should record it officially. As Blair called for a recorder and began the formal interview, Hamish stepped outside. Through the window he could see Lorna beginning her confession again, this time for the official record. She looked almost relieved, as if a great weight were lifting from her shoulders. The truth was coming out after all, just as Euphemia had wanted. But the cost had been so much higher than anyone could have imagined. Hamish walked to his Land Rover, where Lugs waited patiently. The dog looked up at him with sympathetic eyes, as if understanding the sadness of what had just transpired. Come on, boy, Hamish said. Let's go home. There's nothing more to do here. As he drove back to Lochdub, the sun was beginning to rise over the highlands, turning the snow-covered hills gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day, clear and cold. Christmas Eve was tomorrow, and the village would celebrate despite the tragedy that had occurred. But the Kirk's nativity display would have an empty cradle this year. And perhaps, Hamish thought, that was fitting. Some cradles needed to be empty, their secrets finally brought to light. Chapter 10. A Quiet Christmas Reckoning. Christmas Eve arrived in Lochdub with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving the village blanketed in pristine white. Hamish stood at his window, watching smoke rise from chimneys and children building snowmen in their gardens, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Lorna McAllister had been formally charged with murder and was being held in Strathbane pending trial. Blair had taken full credit for solving the case, naturally, though he had grudgingly acknowledged that Hamish's local knowledge had been useful. The DCI had departed yesterday afternoon, eager to be home for Christmas and to bask in the glory of a successful investigation. Hamish had retrieved Euphemia's confession letter from her cottage as Lorna had instructed. He'd read it privately before turning it over to the church elders, and the document had moved him profoundly. Euphemia had detailed every adoption she'd facilitated, every mother she'd counselled or coerced, every child she'd placed or kept. The guilt had poured from every line, along with her desperate hope that confession might bring some measure of peace. The elders had met yesterday evening to discuss what to do with the information. After much debate, they had decided that Euphemia's letter would be read privately to those directly affected by her actions, but would not be made public beyond what would emerge during Lorna's trial. There was mercy in that decision, Hamish thought. The dead deserved some dignity, and the living deserved some privacy. He'd spent the morning visiting the people who'd been touched by this tragedy. Margaret Boyd had received him with tea and a sort of grim satisfaction. So it wasn't any of us after all, she'd said. Just a woman who couldn't face the truth about herself. I suppose I can understand that. We all carry lies we're afraid to have exposed. Will you come to the kirk tonight? Hamish had asked. Margaret had considered this. Perhaps. It's been a long time since I set foot in that building. But Christmas Eve is a night for reconciliation, isn't it? And Euphemia's gone now. Whatever sin she committed, she's answered for them in her own way. Ian Macpherson had been harder to find, but Hamish had eventually tracked him to his mother's grave in the kirkyard. The big man had been standing in the snow, his head bowed. I should hate her, Ian had said when Hamish approached. Euphemia, I mean. She nearly destroyed my family, but I can't quite manage it. She was just a woman who thought she was doing good, making hard choices in difficult times. We all make mistakes. Some just have worse consequences than others. That's a generous way to look at it. Aye, well, Christmas makes fools of us all, doesn't it? Makes us want to forgive and forget. Ian had smiled slightly. My mother would have said this whole affair was God's way of clearing the air before the holy day. She was always finding divine purpose in tragedy. Father Munro had been at the chapel when Hamish stopped by, preparing for evening mass. The young priest had been visibly shaken by the revelations about Euphemia and Lorna. I've been thinking about my argument with Mrs. Grant, he had said, about traditions and change. She was right in a way. Some things, once broken, can't be mended. Some traditions exist because they hold important truths. I was so eager to be progressive, to bring people together, that I didn't consider what might be lost in the process. I don't think that's quite what she meant, Hamish had said gently. Perhaps not, but it's what I've taken from it. Sometimes the old ways persist for good reasons, even if we don't immediately understand them. Now, as the evening approached, Hamish walked through the village toward the kirk. Lugs padded beside him, unusually subdued, as if sensing the solemnity of the occasion. The church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve service. Inside the kirk, nearly every pew was filled. News of what had happened had spread, as news always did in small communities, but people had come anyway, perhaps especially because of what had happened. Tragedy and Christmas had always existed alongside each other, Hamish reflected. The nativity story itself was full of danger and sorrow, of a family fleeing persecution, of a king who ordered children killed. Mr. Wellington stood at the pulpit, looking older and more worn than he had a week ago. Mrs. Wellington sat in the front pew, her usually formidable presence softened by grief. Tonight, the minister began, his voice carrying through the hushed space, we gather in the shadow of loss. Our sister Euphemia has been taken from us, and our sister Lorna faces judgment for that taking. It would be easy to focus on these sorrows, to let them darken this holy night. But I think we must also remember what Christmas teaches us about redemption, about truth, and about the courage it takes to face our own failings. He paused, looking at the congregation. Euphemia Grant spent the last months of her life trying to make amends for mistakes she'd made decades ago. She was preparing to confess publicly, to expose her own sins in the hope of bringing peace to those she'd wronged. That took remarkable courage, and while the manner of her death was tragic, her intention was noble. She wanted to empty the cradle of its secrets, to let truth be born anew. Hamish saw several people nodding, including Margaret Boyd, who sat near the back. As for Lorna McAllister, Mr. Wellington continued, she too was a victim of those long-ago decisions, raised in a web of lies she didn't create. Her actions were wrong, grievously wrong, but they came from a place of desperate fear, a fear we might all understand if we're honest with ourselves. How many of us would be willing to have our entire identity torn apart and examined by the community we love? How many of us could face that with grace? He gestured toward the front of the kirk where the cradle stood. Tonight, as planned, our cradle stands empty, not as a symbol of shame, but as a symbol of truth finally revealed. Empty cradles are not always tragedies. Sometimes they represent an ending that needs to happen before a new beginning can occur. The service proceeded with hymns and prayers, scripture readings, and moments of silence. When it came time for communion, Hamish noticed that Margaret Boyd joined the line, her head held high. Ian Macpherson was there too, and Father Monroe, who'd been invited to participate in this ecumenical gesture. After the service, as people filed out into the starry night, Hamish remained in his pew. He looked at the empty cradle, at the place where the figure of baby Jesus should have been, but wasn't. There was something powerful about that absence, something that spoke to loss and hope in equal measure. Mrs. Wellington approached him, her usual brusqueness tempered by the evening's events. "It's been a terrible time for the village, Hamish, but we'll recover. We always do." "Aye," Hamish agreed, "though it'll take a while. Mr. Sir Wellington wants to know what should be done with the cradle. Some think it should be destroyed, given what's happened. Others think it should be preserved as a memorial." Hamish considered this. Neither. It should be used as it was always meant to be used. Next Christmas, put the baby Jesus in it. Let it be a cradle again, nothing more, nothing less. The sins weren't in the wood, they were in the hearts of the people who used it wrongly. Mrs. Wellington nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom, Hamish. I'll tell my husband." After she left, Hamish walked outside to find Lugs waiting patiently by the door. The village was beautiful in the moonlight, peaceful and serene. Somewhere church bells were still ringing. Somewhere families were gathering around fires and tables, celebrating despite the sorrows of the world. Hamish thought of Lorna, alone in her cell in Strathbane. He thought of Euphemia, her confession finally made, though not in the way she'd planned. He thought of all the mothers and children separated by well-meaning people who'd thought they knew best, who'd believed they were doing God's work. The world was complicated, he reflected. People did terrible things for complicated reasons, and sometimes love itself became twisted into something destructive. But truth had a way of emerging eventually, forcing its way through layers of lies and secrets until it stood naked in the light. "Come on, Lugs," he said to the dog. "Let's go home. There's a fire to tend and a dram of whiskey with our name on it." As they walked through the snowy streets, Hamish felt the weight of the case begin to lift from his shoulders. Justice would be served, such as it could be. The truth had been told, such as it needed to be. And life in Lockdown would go on, because that's what life did. At the police station, he built up the fire and poured himself a generous measure of whiskey. Lug settled in his favourite spot with a contented sigh. From somewhere in the village came the sound of carolers, their voices clear and sweet in the cold air. Hamish raised his glass to the empty room, to absent friends and complicated truths, to empty cradles and the secrets they no longer held. "Merry Christmas, Lockdoob," he said quietly. "May next year be kinder to us all." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the village in a blanket of forgetfulness. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and with it would come new beginnings, fresh hopes, and the eternal promise that even in the darkest times, light would eventually return. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was for reflection, for quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had been learned. Tonight was for sitting by the fire with a faithful dog and a glass of whiskey, letting the peace of Christmas Eve seep into weary bones. And in the kirk, the cradle stood empty at last, its secrets finally gone, waiting patiently to be filled again with something innocent and pure when the time was right. Some traditions, Hamish thought, deserved to continue, and some needed to change. Knowing which was which, that was the real wisdom.